The card season finale took place on October 31st, 1999 at California Speedway in Fontana, and Greg Moore lined up on the grid, knowing it could be one of his last races for Forsythe Racing. He drove with the number 99 Reynard Mercedes, the number being a nod to ice hockey legend Wayne Gretzky. Moore was 24 years old, from New Westminster, British Columbia, and had been racing open-wheel cars since he was a teenager. He won the Players Toyota Atlantic Championship in 1995 at the age of 20, becoming the youngest champion in the history of the series, and moved up to kart IndyCar the same year. By 1997, he'd won his first race at Milwaukee and finished 5th in the championship. He had 5 career car wins by the time he arrived at Fontana, and he'd already signed with Team Penske for the year 2000. Roger Penske chose him personally over a field of more experienced candidates. That morning, a paddock vehicle knocked him off of his motor scooter in the paddock and gashed his hand badly. He had the cut stitched and raced anyway. The title race that weekend was between Juan Pablo Montoya and Dario Franchitti, and Moore's championship chances were long gone, but he was still pushing. On lap 10, running the high line at well over 200 miles per hour, Moore lost rear grip exiting turn 2. The car spun and slid off the track onto the infield grass, which at the California Speedway ran right up the edge of the racing surface with no paved runoff between the track and the turf. The tyres, which had almost no grip on grass, suddenly hit a paved emergency access road cutting across the infield. They bit. The car launched violently, went through a series of flips, and hit the inside concrete retaining wall cockpit first at enormous speed. The wreckage was so complete that the car was unrecognizable as an Indy car. Moore suffered massive head and chest injuries, including a basilar skull fracture. He was killed on impact. Airlifted to Loma Linda University Medical Center, he was pronounced dead at 1:20 p.m. He was the second car fatality of 1999 after Gonzalo Rodriguez was killed at Laguna Seca just weeks earlier. 2 drivers dead in the space of a month rattled the entire series. The race ran to completion. Adrian Fernandez won, and the news was withheld from the other drivers until they'd finished, because CART officials didn't want grief-stricken drivers making mistakes at 220 miles per hour. CART retired the number 99. The grass infield, universally blamed because it launched the car instead of slowing it, was later paved over. Moore's seat at Penske went to a young Brazilian driver named Helio Castroneves, who would go on to win the Indianapolis 500 4 times. On April 30th, 1994, during Saturday qualifying for the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola, Roland Ratzenberger was living a dream that had taken him more than a decade to reach. He was a 33-year-old Austrian and fought his way to Formula 1 through every lower category imaginable, winning the 1986 Brands Hatch Formula Ford Festival, racing touring cars for BMW in the World Touring Car Championship, where he drove an M3 for Schnitzer Motorsports, finishing 3rd in British Formula 3000, and then moving to Japan, where he spent several years racing in Japanese Formula 3000 and won a race at Suzuka. He eventually cobbled together funding through a Monaco businesswoman named Barbara Belleau. Imola was only his 3rd Grand Prix weekend after failing to qualify in Brazil and finishing 11th at the Pacific Grand Prix in Ada, and he was driving a Simtek S941, one of the smallest and least funded teams on the grid, with David Brabham as his teammate. The car was slow and the budget was thin, but Ratzenberger was in Formula 1, and that alone had taken him 15 years to achieve. On his second to last lap, Ratzenberger ran over a curb at the McKee Minerali chicane. It damaged his front wing. Rather than pit for a replacement and lose track position in qualifying, he stayed out and kept pushing. On the next flying lap, accelerating through the fast Villeneuve curve at roughly 195 miles per hour, the front wing failed. 2 mounting bolts gave way and the wing dropped under the front wheels. Without front downforce, the car had no grip and no ability to turn. He went almost straight on into an unprotected concrete wall with no tyre barrier. There was nothing between him and the concrete. The impact was measured at approximately 500 G, the highest ever registered in Formula 1, and caused 3 individually fatal injuries: a basilar skull fracture, a ruptured aorta, and blunt force trauma from the front left wheel assembly penetrating the survival cell. Airlifted to hospital, he was pronounced dead on arrival. No driver had been killed at Formula 1 weekend since Riccardo Paletti at the 1982 Canadian Grand Prix. 12 years earlier, Ayrton Senna was killed at the same circuit the following day. For the next 30 years, whenever someone talked about the 1994 Imola weekend, the conversation was always about Senna, his steering column, and the Italian manslaughter trial. Ratzenberger became the other driver who died at Imola, a man who'd spent his entire adult life fighting his way toward Formula 1 through lower categories, obscure championships, and years in Japan. And when he finally got there, he was killed on his 3rd weekend, and then almost forgotten in the shadow of one of the most famous racers to have ever lived. On February 18, 2001, The Daytona 500 came down to the final lap, and Dale Earnhardt Sr. was running third in the black No. 3 Chevrolet. Earnhardt was 49 and had won 7 Winston Cup championships. Everyone watching knew the car and knew the driver, and they called him the Man in Black. But he wasn't racing for the win, he was blocking for his 2 Dale Earnhardt Inc. drivers running 1 and 2 ahead of him, Michael Waltrip in the 15 car and his son Dale Earnhardt Jr. in the 8. Waltrip had never won a cup race in 462 starts, and Earnhardt was going to make sure he got one by playing rear guard through the final corners. Coming through turn 4, Earnhardt made contact with Sterling Marlin's Dodge, which pushed him back toward the apron. He overcorrected and shot back up the track, where Ken Schrader's number 36 hit him in the passenger side, sending the number 3 nose first into the outside concrete wall at 155 miles per hour, at roughly a 55-degree angle. On television, it didn't look that bad. The car hit the wall, slid down the banking into the infield grass, and stopped. Every NASCAR fan has seen 100 crashes that looked worse, but Ken Schrader pulled alongside, climbed out, walked over, looked into Earnhardt's car, and immediately started waiting frantically for the medical crew. When they asked Schrader later on if he knew right then, he wouldn't answer. Earnhardt suffered a basilar skull fracture, meaning his skull separated from his spine at the base. The autopsy also found a broken left ankle, several broken ribs, a fractured sternum, and cuts across his scalp and chin. Dr. Steve Bohannon saw the classic signs immediately at the medical center: blood from the nose and ears, no pulse, and no breathing. Earnhardt was pronounced dead at Halifax Medical Center at 5:16 p.m. He'd been wearing an open-face helmet and no hands device, a head and neck restraint specifically designed to prevent the exact injury that killed him, which he publicly derided as, quote, "that damn noose." The context made it worse. Earnhardt was the 4th NASCAR driver to die of a basilar skull fracture in approximately 8 months. Adam Petty had died in May 2000 at New Hampshire. Kenny Irwin Jr. had died in July 2000, also at New Hampshire, and Tony Roper died in October 2000 at Texas in the Craftsman Truck Series. The device that could have prevented all 4 deaths had been available for years. About 20 laps before his crash, after watching Tony Stewart's car flip through a multi-car wreck on lap 173, Earnhardt got on the radio to Richard Childress and said, quote, "If they don't do something to these cars, it's going to end up killing somebody." Michael Waltrip won the Daytona 500, his first Cup victory in his 463rd start, and didn't know Earnhardt was dead until after the race. Dale Jr. finished second without knowing either. NASCAR's investigation cost more than $1 million and was published in August 2001. NASCAR mandated head and neck restraints on October 17, 2001. Moving to hands only by 2005. Steel and foam energy-absorbing walls went in at every oval. Full-face helmets and black box data recorders became mandatory, and a dedicated R&D center for crash safety was opened. The entire culture of NASCAR, which for decades had treated safety equipment as optional, and its refusal as a badge of toughness, changed overnight. No NASCAR National Series driver has been killed in a competition since. On October 5, 2014, at Suzuka in Japan, Typhoon Fanfone was bearing down on the region as the Japanese Grand Prix entered its closing stages. It was late in the race, lap 42 of a scheduled 53, and the rain was heavy and getting heavier with the light fading fast. Adrian Sutill's Sauber had already spun off the Dunlop curve on the previous lap, and a recovery crane, a full-size wheel-loader tractor, was on the off area retrieving the car under double-waved yellow flags. 25-year-old Jules Bianchi was driving a Marussia MR03 with Ferrari power. A member of the Ferrari Driver Academy, widely expected to end up in a red car, and Charles Leclerc's godfather, Bianchi had scored Marussia's only championship point in their history, with an 8th place finish at Monaco earlier that year. On lap 43, Bianchi aquaplaned at the same spot where Suttill had crashed. He lost control at 213 km per hour. 2.5 seconds later, his car hit the rear of the crane at 126 km per hour at a 55-degree angle. The left side of the Marussia was obliterated, and the roll structure sheared off as the car was forced under the recovery vehicle, with the chassis registering a 58.8 G impact. Data recovered from Bianchi's earplugs showed a head declaration of approximately 92 G. The impact caused a diffuse axonal injury, which is what happened when the brain decelerates so violently that the nerve fibers inside it are torn apart. Because the medical helicopter couldn't fly in the storm, an ambulance transported him 15 kilometers to a hospital where surgeons operated and placed him in an induced coma. He never regained consciousness. The artificial coma was lifted in November 2014, and he was transferred to a hospital in Nice, where his family sat with him for months, waiting for any sign of recovery that never came. He died on July 17, 2015, 9 months after the crash. His death led directly to the virtual safety car, introduced in 2015, which forced the entire field to slow down without deploying a physical safety car specifically to prevent cars from passing recovery vehicles at racing speed. It's also accelerated work on the Halo, the titanium cockpit protection device that became mandatory in 2018. The Halo likely would not have saved Bianchi given the nature of the impact, but it was later credited with protecting Romain Grosjean when his car split in two and exploded in Bahrain in 2020, and Zhao Guanyu when his car flipped and scraped along a barrier at Silverstone in 2022. Formula One retired the number 17. Bianchi's family disputed the FIA's conclusions, and the question that stuck around the longest was the most straightforward one. Why was a multi-ton crane sitting on a live circuit during a typhoon in fading light, with cars still coming through at over 200 km per hour? If the crane hadn't been there, Jules Bianchi would have slid into a wall, probably walked away, and gone racing the following weekend. On the morning of June 17, 2021, at Grand County International Airport in Moses Lake, Washington, Alex Harville was the opening act at the Moses Lake Air Show. He held the Guinness World Record for the longest dirt-to-dirt motorcycle jump at 297 feet, set back in 2013, and that day, he was going to break the 351-foot ramp-to-ramp distance record set by Australia's Robbie Madison in 2008. 351 feet is roughly the length of a football field, goalpost to goalpost. It was a practice run, the morning warm-up before the show. By multiple accounts, Harville had not jumped this specific ramp configuration before that first attempt. He got what looked like a solid launch off the ramp, but on the way down it became apparent he was short. The motorcycle ran directly into the upper edge of the dirt landing berm and stopped dead, but Harville kept going, catapulted over the handlebars. He tumbled roughly 20 feet, lost his helmet, and hit the ground. The Grand County coroner ruled the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the torso. The autopsy identified the motorcycle's handlebars as the likely source of the fatal injuries. An EMT reached him within about 2.5 minutes. He died either en route to or at the Samaritan Hospital. Local news station KREM, out of Spokane, had been filming but made the decision not to broadcast the footage. He left behind his wife Jessica and 2 sons, 5-year-old Willis and a newborn named Watson. Robbie Madison, whose record Harville had been trying to break, posted a public message saying he was heartbroken for the family. Nobody investigated why Harville was allowed to attempt a record-breaking jump on a ramp setup he'd never used before on his very first run of the day in front of paying spectators. On March 10, 1996, outside Sea Red's Oasis Resort in Mesquite, Nevada, about 80 miles northeast of Las Vegas, a 37-year-old Las Vegas native named Butch Laswell was getting ready to do what he'd done thousands of times before. He grew up in Overton, idolized Evel Knievel, turned professional as a stunt rider, and estimated he'd done more than 5,000 ramp-to-ramp motorcycle jumps over his career. That day, he was going to ride a Honda CR500 off a launch ramp on top of a parking garage, clear a 38-foot high pedestrian bridge spanning Mesquite Boulevard, and land on a downslope ramp about 120 feet from takeoff. Guinness World Records had sent representatives and film crews were on site shooting footage for a movie called Navajo Blue. His personal high jump record was around 41 feet, and he was aiming for 51. The wind had been gusting all afternoon, and the jump had already been delayed. There was real doubts about whether to postpone it entirely. Laswell, reportedly under pressure and being paid roughly $3,000 for the entire stunt, waited for a break in the wind and went for it at about 3:35 in the afternoon. He hit the ramp at about 70 miles per hour and cleared the bridge easily by more than 10 feet, but crosswinds pushed him left and he missed the landing ramp by about a foot. He fell roughly 65 feet onto concrete. His helmet cracked on impact. Witnesses said he tried to steer away from the crowd on the way down. He suffered a crushed trachea, a cracked skull and chest, and massive internal injuries. Paramedics got to him quickly, but a public argument erupted about the quality of the response. Nevada's Lieutenant Governor, Lami Hammergren, who's also a neurosurgeon and happened to be aboard the helicopter that flew Laswell to University Medical Center in Las Vegas, publicly argued that a tracheotomy was needed at the scene and wasn't performed by the Mesquite paramedics. That claim was disputed, but it didn't matter. Laswell was pronounced dead at 4:39 that afternoon. He was paid $3,000. The crowd was estimated at somewhere between 5,000 and 23,000, depending on which promoter you asked. The resort promised to name a walkway after him. Nobody investigated the decision to let him jump in gusting winds. The world of motorcycle stunt performance had no equivalent of the FIA or NASCAR, and no mandated wind limits, also no required secondary landing surface, and no independent safety inspector who could call the whole thing off. On February 8, 1997, at the Orange Bowl in Miami, Roughly 30,000 people, many of them children, packed the stands for a US Hot Rod Monster Jam event. The opening act was a stunt rider named Corey Scott, a 28-year-old from Fort Wayne, Indiana, based in Tampa, Florida. He was self-taught, had performed in over 2,000 shows as part of the Joey Chipwood Chevy Thunder Show, won an ESPN2 ramp-to-ramp jumping competition in Charlotte in 1995, and ran his own stunt outfit called Scott Super Stunts. That night's trick was called a step-up. He rode up a near-vertical ramp at about 65 miles per hour, launched roughly 100 feet through the air, and aimed to land in a large suspended net hoisted high above the stadium floor. He'd already done it 4 times earlier in the evening without a problem. On the 5th attempt, his trajectory was slightly off. He contacted the net, but bounced out of it rather than catching the pocket. He fell to the field below and landed on his head. He suffered a broken neck, plus serious head and chest injuries, was rushed to Jackson Memorial Hospital and pronounced dead. The Dade County medical examiner ruled it accidental, and no charges were filed. Scott had performed in more than 2,000 live shows before that night, and had done this exact trick 4 times already that evening, before the 5th attempt killed him. A South Florida newspaper editorial ran the headline, quote, "Stuntman's death totally avoidable." It pointed out there was no secondary safety net underneath the apparatus, no backup of any kind, just a net, and if you missed it or bounced out, you fell 60-odd feet onto the ground. The editorial asked why a net at that height didn't have a catch system below, and nobody had a good answer. 30,000 people, again many of them children, watched a man bounce out of a net and fall to his death. The footage later turned up in the shock video compilation, banned from television. The Monster Jam never came back to the Orange Bowl. On May 2nd, 1986, on the mountain roads of Corsica during the Tour de Corse, the 5th round of the World Rally Championship, Henri Toivonen was leading the rally. His co-driver was Sergio Cresto. They were in a Lancia Delta S4, a Group B car. Group B cars were the most powerful, dangerous, and most unhinged rally cars ever built, with mid-mounted engines, Kevlar-reinforced composite bodies, and both a supercharger and turbocharger, feeding roughly 500 horsepower into a car that weighed about 890 kilograms. They could hit 60 miles per hour in about 2.3 seconds. They ran on narrow mountain roads, lined with trees, stone walls, ditches, and thousands of spectators standing wherever they felt like, sometimes in the middle of the road, only moving when the car was meters away. Toivonen was annihilating the field. He'd won 11 of the first 17 stages and had a 5-minute lead over Bruno Sebi in second. On stage 18, about 7 kilometers into the Corte Taverna stage, at a tight left-hand corner on the D18 road, there was no guardrail. The car plunged down a ravine and landed on its roof. The fuel tank was mounted directly under the driver's seat. For this all-asphalt event, the team had removed the skid plate to save weight. The tank ruptured against the trees, and the aluminum and composite body ignited instantly. The fire was so ferocious that neither man could get out. Both died in their seats. The entire car burned down to nothing but a blackened tubular space frame. When Bruno Sebi, the next driver through, stopped and looked into the ravine, there was nothing recognizable as a car down there. Nobody knew exactly why the Lancia left the road, as there were no close witnesses. Theories included exhaustion, illness, as Toivonen was reportedly fighting the flu, and the car's own savage power delivery. The Delta S4 had turbo lag so violent that boost could arrive mid-corner without warning, turning a controlled slide into an uncontrolled launch. Within hours, FISA President Jean-Marie Ballester banned Group B cars from competition starting in 1987. The planned successor category, Group S, was also scrapped. Audi and Ford pulled out immediately. The most spectacular and most reckless era in rally history ended on a Friday evening on a Corsican mountain road. A memorial slab to Toivonen and Cresto stands at the corner where they went off. The Race of Champions was created in 1988 in Toivonen's memory. Toivonen's death wasn't even the first Group B tragedy of that season. At the Rally Portugal in March, Joaquim Santos had lost control of a Ford RS200 and driven into spectators, killing 3 and injuring more than 30, but the category kept running until Corsica. The IZOD IndyCar World Championship season finale on October 16, 2011 at Las Vegas Motor Speedway had a promotional hook that made a lot of people in the paddock uncomfortable. Dan Weldon, a British 33-year-old 2-time Indianapolis 500 winner, most recently 5 months earlier, was between full-time rides and had been working as the development driver for the 2012 chassis. IndyCar CEO Randy Bernard had put together a stunt, a $5 million prize to be split between Weldon and a randomly selected fan if Weldon could win the race starting from the back of the 34-car field. 34 open-wheel cars on a 1.5-mile high-banked oval. Everyone with half a brain knew this was dangerous. The cars were packed so tightly that any contact would ripple through the entire field. On lap 11 of a planned 200, it did. Wade Cunningham clipped James Hinchcliffe. Cunningham and J.R. Hildebrand collided. Hildebrand went airborne. Cars started spinning and catching fire across the width of the track. 15 were involved. Weldon, approaching from the back at around 220 miles per hour, had already scrubbed speed to about 165, but there was nowhere to go. He hit Charlie Kimball's car and launched. His car sailed 325 feet through the air, barrel rolling, and struck the catch-fenced cockpit first. A steel fence post penetrated the cockpit and hit the lower left of his crash helmet. IndyCar president Brian Barnhart called it a non-survivable injury. Weldon was airlifted to University Medical Center and pronounced dead about 2 hours later. The race was abandoned, and the remaining drivers ran a 5-lap tribute, several of them openly weeping in their cockpits. The 2012 chassis was renamed the Dallara DW12 in Weldon's honor, since he'd be the one developing it. IndyCar never raced at Las Vegas Motor Speedway again. The investigation used the phrase, quote, perfect storm, which was a very diplomatic way of saying that a $5 million prize structure requiring 34 cars on a tight oval at 220 miles per hour was a promotional gimmick that got a man killed. On September 5, 2010, at the Misano circuit in Italy for the San Marino Grand Prix Moto 2 race, a 19-year-old Japanese rider named Shoya Tomizawa was having a solid weekend. Tomizawa had made history just 5 months earlier by winning the very first Moto2 race ever held at Catazo Sale Circuit by nearly 5 seconds. He'd taken pole position at the second round too. He was 6th in the championship. At Misano, he was running 4th on lap 12 through the fast right-hander called Corvone at the exit to the back straight, which was the quickest point on the circuit where bikes reached 140 plus miles per hour. He lost the front end and went down. In a car, he'd have hit the barriers. On a motorcycle, a fallen rider slides along the ground, and where they end up depends on what the surface does to them. Tomizawa slid back across the racing line. Alex DeAngelis hit him first, then Scott Redding, who was only 17 years old, hit him second. The force flung Redding more than 100 meters down the road off area. Tomizawa suffered massive cranial, thoracic, and abdominal trauma. He was treated at the Circuit Medical Center and put on artificial respiration, then transported by ambulance to a hospital. They used an ambulance instead of a helicopter so they could maintain the respiratory support. He was pronounced dead at 2:20 p.m. The MotoGP main event had already started 20 minutes earlier on the same track. The riders behind Tomizawa could see his body on the ground and could not stop. The closing speed was too high, the track too narrow, and the braking distance on a motorcycle at 140 plus was too long. When a rider went down and slid back into the racing line, the people behind had full visibility and zero ability to avoid him. DeAngelis walked away. Redding, who needed 10 stitches in his back, had to live with the knowledge that his bike hit Tomizawa, and there was nothing he could have done differently. On October 23, 2011, at Sepang in Malaysia for the Malaysian Grand Prix, Marco Simoncelli was running 4th on lap 2. A 24-year-old Italian and the 2008 250cc world champion, Simoncelli rode a Gresini Honda RC212V with the number 58. He was in his second season in the top class and threading through turn 11. He lost the front end. In most crashes, the bike slid and the rider slid with it, both heading for the gravel trap, but Simoncelli's tyres caught the asphalt again. The bike gripped and veered back across the track, with Simoncelli still hanging off the right side of the machine, facing forward, completely exposed. He was dragged back into the middle of the racing line. Colin Edwards and Valentino Rossi were right behind him, and neither had time to do anything. Both hit him at race speed, and the impacts ripped Simoncelli's helmet off his head. He lay motionless on the track. Simoncelli suffered severe trauma to the head, neck, and chest. He was unconscious at the scene and went into cardiac arrest almost immediately. Medical crews performed CPR for about 45 minutes before he was pronounced dead at 4:56 p.m., less than an hour after the crash. The race was red flagged and then cancelled entirely. Edwards dislocated his shoulder. Rossi returned to the pits, physically uninjured, but devastated. The image of Simoncelli's helmet being torn off remained one of the most harrowing things ever broadcast in motorcycle racing. It led to urgent questions about helmet retention and chin strap standards, and the FIM eventually introduced a dedicated racing helmet standard, FRH PHE01, which became mandatory across MotoGP, Moto2, Moto3, and World Superbikes from June 2019. The Misano circuit was renamed the Misano World Circuit Marco Simoncelli in 2012. On March 15, 1977, at the Kyalami Circuit in South Africa for the third race of the Formula One season, a 27-year-old Welshman named Tom Price was driving a Shadow DN8, a black and gold car from a small British team that had no business being as fast as it was. Price had won the non-championship Race of Champions in 1975, becoming the only Welshman to ever win a Formula One race, and he was devastatingly fast in the rain. But Shadow didn't have Lotus money or McLaren engineering, and so Price spent most of his career in machinery that wasn't good enough to show what he could really do. He'd qualified 15th that weekend after being fastest in the Wet Wednesday practice by a full second over Niki Lauda. He made a poor start and dropped to the back, but by lap 22, he clawed his way to the 13th. His teammate Renzo Zorzi had pulled off to the side of the track with a fueling metering fault that was pumping fuel directly onto the engine. The engine caught fire. Two marshals ran across the live racing surface to help. One was a 25-year-old named Bill. The other was Frederik Jansen van Buren, a 19-year-old carrying a 40-pound fire extinguisher. Hans Joachim Stuck, the car directly ahead of Price, saw the marshals and swerved right. He missed them by inches. Price, tucked right behind Stuck's car and completely blind over the brow of the hill, didn't see a thing. He hit Jansen van Buren at approximately 170 miles per hour. He was killed instantly, with his body being torn apart so badly that he could only be identified later when all the marshals were summoned and counted. The fire extinguisher he was holding struck Price in the head, wrenching his helmet upward, and the chin strap nearly decapitated him. He died instantly, with his body remaining in the cockpit as the driverless Shadow continued at full speed down the straight, scraping along the barriers, and slammed into Jacques Laffitte's Ligier at the first corner. Lafitte was able to walk away. The fire extinguisher had flown over a grandstand into the car park, where it jammed into a parked car's door. The footage doesn't show Price crashing, but it does show him crashing into Frederik Jansen van Buren at almost lightning speed, with his body flying off into the railings. Of course, he was already dead before he even hit the wall. Naturally, the thing that made it stick with people who saw it wasn't the speed or the fire, it was how fast it all happened. From the moment Stuck swerved to the moment Price hit the marshal, less than a second passed. There was literally nothing anyone could have done. Niki Lauda won that race. It was his first victory since his near-fatal crash at the Nürburgring the year before, when he'd been pulled from a burning car with his lungs scorched and his face melted. When he was told what had happened to Price, he said there was no joy after that. Price was 27 and Jansen van Buren was only 19, and between them, they left behind a total of 0 safety reforms. Nobody changed the rules about marshal access to the track. The deaths were simply treated as freak accidents, and Formula One just moved on to the next race. On May 15, 1982, pole day for the Indianapolis 500, Gordon Smiley went out to qualify the number 35 Intermedics March 81C Cosworth for Bob Fletcher Racing. Smiley was 36, a former journalism graduate from the University of Nebraska, who'd quit writing about racing to do it instead. He'd spent nearly 2 decades working his way through SCCA Formula Ford, Formula Atlantic, Can-Am, Formula 5000, and Trans Am, setting 25 track records and winning multiple divisional championships along the way. In 1979, he'd raced in the British Aurora Formula One series for the Surtees team, won at Silverstone, and finished the season with 8 top 10 results from 11 races. He qualified for the Indy 500 twice before, finishing 25th in 1980 and 22nd in 1981 after a crash on lap 141. He was a road racer by instinct and training, and that was unfortunately what led to his end. Earlier that morning, Rick Mears had taken pole at over 207 miles per hour. Smiley told his car owner he intended to run 200 miles per hour or die trying. His crew chief, Derek Mower, told him to take it easy because they had a backup car. Smiley said they wouldn't need one. Several veteran drivers had already warned him that his road racing reflexes were dangerous on a high-speed oval in a ground effects car. On road courses, when the back end stepped out, you caught the slide. At Indianapolis, in a car that generated massive downforce until the moment it didn't, catching the slide was the worst thing you could do. On his warm-up lap, entering turn 3 at approaching 200 miles per hour, the rear end broke loose. Smiley did what every road racer's muscle memory told him to do. He corrected. The front tires bit, the ground effects snapped back, and the car fired nose first across the track directly into the outside concrete wall. The impact disintegrated the March chassis. The fuel tank exploded, the wreckage went airborne and scattered through the short chute between turns 3 and 4, with Smiley's body tumbling through the debris for hundreds of feet. Dr. Steve Olvey, CART's medical director, reached the scene and later described it in his memoir, Rapid Response, as the worst trauma he had ever witnessed. He wrote that Smiley's helmet was gone, along with the top of his skull, and that there were small grey splotches on the track surface leading up to the body, which turned out to be brain matter, and that on a cursory examination, Nearly every bone in his body appeared to be shattered. There was a massive wound in his torso that's Olve compared to a shark attack. Death was instantaneous. Track announcer Tom Carnegie informed the crowd at 12:48 p.m., roughly half an hour after the crash. No immediate safety changes followed. Cars were faster the next year, and Jim Hitman was killed in another March 81C less than 2 months later in Milwaukee. But the lesson from Smiley's crash became a staple of Indianapolis rookie orientation for decades afterward. On an oval, let the car spin. The reflex that kept road racers alive on tight circuits would get them killed at the speedway. To this day, Smiley is the last driver to die during Indy 500 qualifying. At about 6:26 in the evening on June 11, 1955, during lap 35 of the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the pit straight was packed with spectators standing behind nothing more than a low earthen bank. There were 250,000 people at the circuit. Mike Hawthorne, leading in his Jaguar D-Type, braked hard and pulled right to enter the pits after getting a signal from his team. Hawthorne's Jaguar had disc brakes. Almost nobody else on the grid did. Disc brakes stopped a car in roughly half the distance of drum brakes at those speeds. Lance Macklin, running in a much slower Austin Healey 100S on drum brakes, was right behind Hawthorne. He couldn't stop anywhere near as fast. He swerved left to avoid rear-ending the Jaguar, and in doing so, pulled directly into the path of Pierre Levay's Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR, which was closing at around 150 miles per hour. Levay's front wheel rode up over the tapered rear of Macklin's Austin Healey, which acted like a launch ramp. The Mercedes went airborne at around 125 miles per hour, cleared the earthen embankment, hit a concrete stairway, and ripped apart. The engine block, radiator, front suspension, and bonnet tore through the packed grandstand like shrapnel. Levy was thrown from the car and killed instantly from a crushed skull. His co-driver, John Fitch, hadn't taken his stint yet and was standing in the pits. The Mercedes had a body made of electron, a magnesium alloy. Magnesium burned at thousands of degrees, and when water hit burning magnesium, the fire got worse, not better. The rescue crews didn't know that, and hosed it down, which made the fire explode, and it burned for hours. 83 spectators were killed, more than 120 were injured. The dead included men, women, and children who had been standing behind nothing more than a low earthen bank, meters from cars doing 150 miles per hour. It was the deadliest accident in the history of motorsport, and nothing since has come close. And the race continued for another 19 hours. Officials made the calculation that 250,000 people trying to leave at once would gridlock the roads and block ambulances from reaching the casualties. A photograph of Hawthorne celebrating his win with a bottle of champagne, taken while bodies were still being recovered across the track, became one of the most controversial images in sporting history. The French magazine L'Auto Journal captioned it saying, quote, "To your health, Mr. Hawthorne." Mercedes pulled out of racing entirely at the end of the season. France, Spain, and Germany suspended racing. Switzerland banned circuit racing outright, and that ban lasted until 2022. John Fitch, Levy's co-driver, who never got to take his turn at the wheel, spent the rest of his life designing safety barriers. The Fitch barrier, those yellow barrels full of sand you see on highway off-ramps, are in fact his invention, designed to make sure a tragedy like this never happens again. And that's the end of the video, folks. If you found this one interesting, then please be sure to give it a like, leave a comment, subscribe if you're new, and consider donating on Patreon. All patrons get early ad-free access to videos, and higher tiers get their name on the screen and a shout-out. I'd like to give a shout out to all of my patrons for their continued support, especially those whose names you're seeing on screen now: Raina, Toka355, The Amazing, Crazy and Scary World of Squishy 200815, The Vampire, Arthur Jones, Soak Pigeon, Bradley Stewart, Squall and Fury, Stahlsturm, John Aaron Snow, Psychic Perk, Bohag, Peanut Mama 0724, Vampiric Misfit, Hendrik Fan 5, Sunny Hauser, Bailey Cosmic Black Metal 96, Mimi, Lagged Into Sunlight, KJ Musical, Losanna, Brandon Field, Helen Korn, Kyle, Brendan O'Connell, Adam Clayton, Cal Nagula, Edward Howard, Danny Jade, Paul Mendoza, Alex Christmas, Bella Schwartz, Belsey Gell, Stimulate, Inquisitor Zarius, and Dick the Cock Johnson and the Woodmaster at WrestleMania X69 or maybe not Dude. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.